Hi, guys. This is SAAD for the SAAD Truth. Another fantastic and interesting guest for you today. I have with me Ken Klonsky. Let me just read you some of his background and then I'll cede the floor to him to say hi. He is the director of Innocence International, which is an outfit that tries to help wrongly convicted individuals. He is the author of several books, most recently, Freeing David McCallum, which will be the focus of our. Can you see me? Can you see?
I
Okay.
see.
Which is the focus of our current discussion. Life Without, Eye of the Hurricane, My Path from Darkness to Freedom, Songs of Aging Children. It's a collection of short stories. Taking Steam, a play, I think, from the early 80s. And then he's also the father of Ray Klonsky, who, along with another gentleman by the name of Mark Lamy, produce a documentary on the story that we'll be talking about. Welcome on the show, Ken.
Thank you, Gad. Nice to be here.
Likewise, it's such a pleasure. I want to tell people how I came across, your story and that of David, and on the power of the social platforms that we today have. I was sitting at home and I just stumbled on the documentary, David and Me. I think on Netflix it has a slightly different title, but anyways, I started watching it. Of course, I became absolutely gripped by it. I was so moved, not only by your perseverance in trying to free David McCallum, but also by David's unbelievable poise and grace at having suffered what he suffered, 29 years in prison. I thought, you know what, I've got to contact these guys because there are a lot of life lessons that we could reap from their stories. So I guess my first question is maybe you could walk us through how you first heard of David, how you connected with him, your link to Hurricane Carter, another famous guy who was wrongly in prison. So tell us the whole story.
When I was living in Toronto, I was a teacher, and the young people at school, I had taken them to see The Hurricane, the Norman Jewison film with Denzel Washington. And like me, they were deeply affected by it. There was some very deep-seated psychological reaction to the film. And I didn't understand what that was. But when we got back, or the next day, they said they wanted to meet him. Rubin, that is, not Denzel, although I'm sure they'd have been happier to meet Denzel. But he lived in Toronto, and I had to find out where. And I was lucky enough, my friend's son lived across the street from him. So I got the address, and we all wrote to him. And it was less than a week later, he phoned our place, our house, and he said that he'd be happy to come in. So he came in and spoke to the students and really transformed their lives. I won't go into detail about that, except to say that most of them graduated, and this was a class of young people that wasn't doing too much reading or had very little academic interests. So that was wonderful in itself. I also thought that I wanted to, because of some of the things he said in front of the class, I wanted to understand a bit more about what he was talking about, mostly metaphysical things, Gurdjieff and Krishnamurti, things that I was not familiar with. So I asked him if he'd do an interview with the Sun magazine in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, because they have the most unexpurgated, no ads. They really give people their say. And Rubin really wanted to do it because people still may have seen him as a boxer or a person who spent a long time in prison, but he'd also developed his mind to an extraordinary degree. And he would be happy to have this kind of credibility. In fact, he got a couple of honorary law degrees subsequent to this, and was very proud of it, obviously, and so were people in the community. Anyway, we did the interview. He loved it, and when it came out, and at some point soon after that, there were two kind of dramatic developments. One is that he quit the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted. There was an ethical dispute. And the other was that he decided that he wanted to write a book. And so I was there in both cases. I was a writer, so I was able to sit with him and interview him for a long period of time. Oh, there, 20, 30, 40 hours of tape. It's usually a huge amount of stuff that's at Tufts University now, where they took most of his stuff.
Why is it at Tufts?
There's a man there named, and if I can't remember his name, he was a man who brought all kinds of books and food when Rubin was incarcerated in New Jersey. Tom. Tom really had a kind of relationship with Rubin that I had later on. He was always interested in Rubin's life. And at a certain point, he said he would like to have an archive at Tufts and hopefully also have an Innocence project there. But the Innocence project never materialized. But the archive is there.
I see. So, before you go on, I just want to contextualize Hurricane Carter in terms of my personal life. I grew up in Lebanon. We were part of the last group of Lebanese Jews that had remained in Lebanon, and then the Civil War broke out. We left. But growing up with much older siblings, I have 3 siblings, all of whom are 10 years plus older than me. I remember one of my brothers always playing. Sort of one of the emblematic songs of my childhood is listening to Bob Dylan's rendition of that of Hurricane's story. And I remember, I was a child who did not speak English at that point. I might have understood some of it, but I spoke Arabic. That was my mother tongue. I spoke French, but certainly not English. And even though I only truly found out what the song was about later in life, I could sense that it dealt with something very painful. There was something very melancholic about the song. And so that's my original, exposure to this tragic story. But go on.
Well, that was the origin of the film. Yeah. They pretty well followed Dylan's plot to make the movie. And there were things in the film that were true, very true, and there were things in the film that were false. Some of the falsehoods actually came from Dylan's not fully being aware of what had happened. But it is a great song. My goodness, yeah.
Did you ever get a chance to meet Dylan through your friendship with Carter?
I wish, no. Yeah.
He's a unicorn. He doesn't exist, right?
They obviously were very kind when we used a couple of quotes of his in Eye of the Hurricane. Right. They were really accommodating, and they wished him well and everything. So nice. They had a good relationship at one point.
Okay, so this sets the ground for how you met Rubin, and then how does David McCallum get into the story?
David wrote, well, actually, it is a wonderful story in as much as David was at the prison. And obviously, he saw another prisoner reading the Sun magazine and had no idea what was in it. But he went and he asked the guy if he could take a look at it. And it turned out that was the interview that I did with Rubin. And David was the most indefatigable person, he still is, that I have ever met. He was not going to leave a stone unturned. He was going to get out of that prison one way or another, and the odds against it were astronomical. But he wrote me a letter. I had just started out with Rubin with this new Innocence project, Innocence International. I didn't know what I was doing. I had no legal experience. I was simply a teacher. But the letter was beautiful. What a fine writer.
David. So this is when? What year is this roughly, so that we can sort of get
2004.
Okay, so about 13 years ago. Okay.
Yeah, and it was a beautifully written letter, and I felt something. Remember, being a teacher, may not know anything about law, but I did know something about writing, and the writing just felt so true to me. So I wrote him back and I said, I'll talk to Rubin about it. We've started off with this new Innocence project, and I'll tell him about you, and we'll see where it goes from there. I couldn't make him any promises. But Rubin read the letter, and he said, well, you tell him we're going to come there, and we're going to help him out. That wasn't quite right, because, in fact, he was going to the prison with me to assess David. Rubin.
I mean, if he's a scammer, if he's telling the truth, he just wants to read whether there's veracity to what he's saying. Is that what you mean?
No, he accepted, I think, right off that David was telling the truth. Rubin was quite instinctual on that one, but it didn't matter to him whether it mattered. I mean, you had to be innocent.
Right. I hope so. Yeah.
But the issue for him, the 50% of the issue, was what kind of person is this? Because if I help get this person out of prison and he goes out and commits a crime because prison has destroyed him in some way, then that affects every wrongly convicted prisoner everywhere. So you can't risk having a person come out, even if they're innocent.
Although I was going to say, I mean, doesn't that put you in a bit of a moral, ethical conundrum? Because you're basically saying it's a kind of a consequentialist ethic. You're saying, maybe we shouldn't get this innocent guy out. If he's become so dangerous, well, too bad. Might as well let him rot in jail. Did that not cause him a bit of conflict in his mind? Rubin?
I don't think that was his attitude. I think it was simply, all right, someone else will help him.
Okay.
But I don't want to do it. I don't mean me, but Rubin didn't want to do it because he didn't want to be associated with some calamity. That did happen with a guy out in California. I don't remember his name, but they got him out of prison. It was a wrongful conviction. It was him and another guy. And he went out and committed a rape. And when they put him back in prison, that was it. The door was shut. There was no way he was coming out. And it also damaged the reputation of the Innocence Project that had gotten him out.
Wow. Okay, so then David, Rubin, did you go with him to that original meeting in prison to meet David?
Of course,
okay.
Yeah. I went there with him and Alonzo Starling, who was driving the car, and I think we met. No, we didn't meet the lawyer there. Absolutely not. He hadn't been part of this yet. So that's right.
So you meet. He sort of clears your checks, or certainly Rubin's. He's a good guy, and now sort of what's the trajectory of the journey from then to, I guess he was released, was it 2 years ago or two?
Yeah, 2014.
He was released. Okay. So then what transpired within that 10-year period?
Well, in essence, that's the subject of the book.
The book, exactly.
To get a person out of prison, I had this really naive view that as soon as the people in authority saw that the person had been wrongly convicted, that it was a simple matter that they would just go there and they say, hey, you're out, and the door's open and the guy walks out of prison. But what I learned, and it's a terrible lesson for somebody in this field, what I learned is that they'll do everything in their power to keep him in there. They'll find every argument to say, oh, well, we still think it's a good conviction. When a child could tell you that this conviction was a terrible conviction, but they've deluded themselves into believing it because they don't want to lose their reputations.
That's what I was going to ask you. I mean, as a psychologist, I find this very interesting. Is it literally as simple as it is difficult for most people to have the humility to admit when they're wrong, especially on something that is as high a stake as this, and therefore, even though in my heart of hearts I absolutely know that you're right, I'm going to double down and I'm going to fight you to the death and be adversarial? I mean, is that basically it?
Could be either.
Okay, wow.
It depends on the individual. There are many people who work in district attorney's offices who are honest people, but they don't know the psychological pull on them. They don't understand. Although they know full well that if this guy gets out of prison, everybody in that office is going to have their reputation damaged
Right.
because they all conspired to keep him in there. But there are other ones who just say, too bad. He's in prison. He would have been there for some reason anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Wow. So let me. I'll later for the viewers who are watching this exchange later. I'll be chatting actually with David McCallum, and I'll certainly pose him the following question. But I'll ask you as a sort of third party, what is it that, from your experience, leads people to admit to a crime as serious as this when they haven't committed it? Many people find that completely baffling. I mean, I'm not willing to admit that I stole chewing gum if I didn't, let alone that I murdered somebody. So walk us through that dynamic.
A young person, first of all, I would say youth is the first issue. The young person comes into a police station interrogation and is confronted with not only choices that are very difficult, but also pretty intimidating and powerful looking people who are saying things to him that are very frightening. I say him, it's mostly boys, mostly
Sure.
young men. And I shouldn't say she there. The problem for the young person is, the first thing is they think, and I have to say this also goes for older people as well, they think because they haven't committed a crime that the truth is actually going to be the issue that will get them out of prison.
So I'll admit right now to whatever you want so I could go home to my parents tonight because I'm getting hungry and I need to go to the bathroom. I'll clear that hurdle. And then when it comes down to sort of, trying to navigate through all of the issue, the truth will come out. But let me admit to it now so I can go home.
Yeah, and there's no lawyer there telling them don't do it. That's right. It actually is, they minimize. That's one of the things they do. It's not say that they admit to having done the crime to go home. What the police tell them is, look, especially when they've done it with someone else, that guy says that you did it. In this case, it was Willie Stuckey, David's friend. And Willie said that you did it. Well, we know that you didn't do it. We know that he's the one who did it, but we need you to tell us.
So a classic prisoner's dilemma, if you know what that is.
Mm-hmm.
Right, it's the
Will you tell us?
Yeah.
Mm.
Wow. Okay, so then so you guys meet, you start working together. Let's fast forward to the end. Have we identified who the real killers are? I didn't follow through to that. Do we know now who it is on?
Well, nothing for certain because, again, you're now at 29 years, but we always had a pair of suspects in mind. If we didn't, we wouldn't have had much of a case. But the suspects came out through police reports and trial transcripts. These two young, well, they're not so young now, but at the time they were in their 20s. And they were career criminals who did a lot of carjacking. In fact, they had done 8 carjackings within the 48-hour period before the young man that they kidnapped and shot, who David and Willie were convicted for killing. So these two guys were, one of them worked in the hardware store where the can of kerosene that was used to burn the car was found. So we thought we had some pretty good information. Not only that, but a woman had seen 2 guys, and she said they were 20 or so. One was quite tall. The other was very short. David and Willie were the same size. Neither of them had ever driven a car. And these 2 guys went past her. And then and this was just before the kidnapping supposedly took place. And they drove this young man back to Brooklyn from Queens. And that, to me, for me personally, was the big reason that I thought we should help David, because I knew I had lived in New York for 21 years, and I could not drive from Queens to Brooklyn. It's actually not that easy to go from one borough to another unless you know the roads. And so I figured, no way, these two 16-year-olds who didn't even have driver's licenses would ever be able to do that.
So what? Forgive me. I've only perused through your book, so maybe some of these answers to my questions are already in your book. But did you sort of pinpoint the source of the police behavior? Was it ineptitude, or was there something more sinister, or just human error, and then we double down because we don't want to admit that we're wrong? Or was there something more sinister? They're trying to frame them because what's the bottom line? Why did this happen?
In David's case, I think it was sinister. Because the two real suspects, and the police knew who they were. They knew exactly who they were. They interviewed them. But those suspects, were hardened, and they weren't going to give the police any information. Once they realized that, they were much more inclined to go after two 16-year-olds. As long as they were given the name by these very suspects. That's where they got Willie Stuckey's name.
Right.
They got it from these people. So that's one thing. And the other thing was that David and Willie were young enough so that, as I was saying, they're very easy to take advantage. These two guys were hardcore criminals, and his sister, the sister of one of them, said they had dirty dealings with the police. That's the word she used, dirty dealings.
I'm sorry. So what makes it then sinister? Is it as simple as there is pressure on us to solve this crime? We're unlikely to crack these more hardened criminals. Let's at least bat a win, or get a win for the team by framing these guys, and we could move on and everybody's happy. And anyways, as you said, these are guys who probably are going to end up being criminals if they're not already. I mean, is that the calculus that's going in their head?
Yes, along with the fact that the victim was white, a young white man.
Okay.
They had to have people arrested. The pressure was huge. If it were another black person, I don't think they'd have done that. It was racial. So they're telling the neighborhood, oh, we're doing our job and this and that. Well, look at that. We've got two guys. They've just admitted to the crime. And that's it. That's really what it's about.
In all the years that you were interacting with David leading up to eventually his incredible release, were you able to detect profound changes in his hope, his demeanor, his mood? Or was he always sort of steadfast in his desire? I mean, how did, if you were to track your interactions with him on an affective state, how was that trajectory or that curve?
Well, your hand actually told the story. Okay. It's a roller coaster.
Right.
His moods passed. There would be elation, thinking I'm going to get out soon, and then there would be terrible depression. Which took its toll on not only him, but all of us. He would phone constantly, some weeks 3 or 4 times, other weeks when he was feeling better, it would be one time, maybe twice. And he had supports all around. He had a friend of mine in Washington, my sister in South Carolina. He had many people he could call. But my friend in Washington, who was a psychiatric social worker, and myself were the main receivers of his depression.
Wow. Yeah. So which I guess leads me to my next question. Of course, any suffering that you experience in bringing this stuff home with you is nothing compared to what he's experiencing. I mean, he's the guy who's in a little box for 3 decades. But undoubtedly, when you are facing, when you're being exposed to these injustices and you want to do everything you can to intervene and help these people, but things are not moving, does that have a profound effect on you on a day-to-day basis? Or are you able to compartmentalize in the way you'd like to think that a good psychiatrist or clinical psychologist does? You don't want to hear about child sex abuse for 8 hours in your office and then bring it home and have it kill you. That wouldn't be good for anyone. So were you able to create some sort of discipline that allowed you to compartmentalize, or were you sitting there suffering every moment as you try to free these innocent people?
I can't compartmentalize. So it was following me around for 10 years.
Wow.
And again, his suffering was far worse. That's what kept me going.
Right. So are you guys now, I mean, now that he's out, have you, I mean, do you hang out with, I mean, I know you live in different places, but how often do you see each other? How often do you speak to one another now that he's a free man?
Oh, we have a friendship.
Okay.
I'd say I speak to him maybe once every 2 weeks. And he's also friends with my son, Ray, who's now living in New York. So, it will always be friends.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about Ray, because it's ultimately his movie that turned me into that story. And we have one thing in common. Ray was a student at my fantastic Concordia University. So tell us a bit about your son and about his link to Concordia University.
He was in the communications department there. And he was getting into a lot of trouble even before he was in Concordia.
Trouble, academic trouble, or criminal?
No, he was getting into trouble with police and with other people. We had just hired a second lawyer. This was in Quebec. We had originally hired one in Ontario. So we looked at each other, my wife and I, and said, okay, we got to do something here. And so I'd helped David for a year and a half. And I thought, give him a chance, David, to help someone else. Maybe he can help my son.
And it could give him a sense of purpose. I mean, to David, right? It could sort of break him out of the prison walls, because he now has a direct link to someone who he's helping. So it closes the circle of reciprocity in a sense, right?
Yes, it was a lucky thought that I had. It was selfish on my part because I needed help. But David turned out to be a far better therapist than any other that I could have ever found. And he also told Ray in no uncertain terms that his behavior was going to get him into serious trouble. He already had been in serious trouble. Wow. In fact, he had spent some time in prison there in Montreal. So, about 3 hours. Again, had he been indigent, he probably would have spent a lot more time in there. But we weren't always going to be there to bail him out. You know what I'm saying? So David took up with this project. And so Ray, in gratitude for this friendship, he and his friend Mark Lamy at Concordia decided they were going to make a film about wrongful convictions to get David out. And the film, because of the people who eventually financed the film, they said, no, you're not going to be talking about wrongful convictions. This is going to be about your relationship to David McCallum. That's what they said to Ray, and that's exactly what the film became. And they were right. That was the subject that makes that film a film of the heart.
Wow. So was that project started as part of an academic exercise at Concordia? Or was it after he had graduated?
It was not an academic exercise.
Okay, wow.
In fact, when they graduated, that was when most of the work began.
And is he now a filmmaker, or was this a one-shot thing that he wanted to do as part of his relationship with David?
He is a filmmaker, but right now he's in advertising in a big company in New York. And I mean, that's part of what you learn, that getting a film script done is miraculously lucky, like getting someone out of prison. You think, oh, well, it's going to be easy. I'm going to get another film script. I'm going to do this and that. I'm going to get another person out of prison. But it's not. These are very large goals. It took him 7 years, he and Mark, to make the movie. It took us 10 years to get David out of prison. That's a big chunk of one's life. So
unbelievable, incredible. I guess I'll ask David tonight when I speak to him directly, but I think he now has a child, doesn't he?
He does. A lovely little daughter. Yeah. It's that's been, I think, the biggest change and the most wonderful thing that's happened to him.
I was very touched by it, because as David and I were chatting with one another on the phone to try to, schedule our meeting, our chat, I heard a little girl sort of speaking to him, and then I think, if I remember correctly, I asked him if that was his daughter or something to that effect, and it reminded me of the very poignant and powerful moment in the movie where I think he intimated his desire to hopefully one day get out of prison, and he was really keen on. Sorry.
I know how you feel.
And I thought that was very touching. I thought it was incredible.
Yeah, that was an extraordinary moment that Ray was able to elicit from him. It really was. And the fact that it happened, well, the whole story is something inspiring and miraculous. As the book is called The Last Miracle of Rubin Hurricane Carter. That's the subtitle.
Incredible. Now, had Rubin passed away before the news came that he was being? Did he get to know that this happened, or he passed away before it?
He passed away before it, but we had written this letter together, and the letter was, I think, one of the largest things that it was the letter written to the new district attorney, Ken Thompson, and I think it was highly persuasive. And that's when a lot of people were brought in to look into the case. It was part of Thompson's mandate to write a lot of these wrongful convictions. Brooklyn was absolutely awful. And so anyway, this was a little window because Thompson died soon after David was released.
And the wrongly convicted gentleman, William, what was his name?
Willie Stuckey.
Willie Stuckey. He died in prison, correct?
Yes, he did.
So he never. Okay, wow. How long ago was that?
2001.
Oh boy. Okay.
That was quite a wrench for David, and you can ask him about it. That wasn't.
I will. I was going to ask you a few other sort of dark questions, but I feel that we should better end it on a more positive note and on the emotional note that we're on. What are some projects? Are you still involved with the Innocence Project?
Yeah, we're on the final case that Rubin picked up. He visited Atif Rafay in Washington. Atif Rafay and Sebastian Burns were convicted of killing Rafay's family, supposedly to get insurance money to make a movie. Movies seem to have so much to do with all of this stuff. Right. To me, right from the start, this was the most ridiculous motive that could be attributed to killing somebody's family. And there are reasons to believe that there are other people involved. Now, we've been involved in this case since 2007, so it's now taken longer than David's case. But it's highly challenging, and it demands a lot of research. We have a lot of volunteers in Canada and the United States. A total of 15 people are working on this case right now.
How many different projects do you typically work on? Or do you just focus sort of one big project at a time? How does that work?
Well, manpower being what it is, this is the last, and it's one, except that there are small things going on that you help other people out with. Right. So somebody will write and say, look, I have a problem. I have a wrongly convicted sister or brother. So you ask them where they live, and you refer them to other Innocence projects. Mostly, I would say close to 100% of Innocence projects know who Rubin Carter is.
Right.
And he contributed, a lot of time to raising millions of dollars for these projects. So,
are there any stats, if you were to look at sort of the collection of all manifestations of Innocence projects, are there any stats that say, out of 100 cases that are, quote, opened by some outfit of Innocence, what percentage ends up resulting in the person in question being freed? What are the odds typically?
I'd say they're very great odds, very bad. But I don't know the percentage.
Very high odds that they'll be released or not released.
Oh, yeah, I misstated that. You wouldn't make a lot of money betting on somebody getting out of prison. Let's put it that way. Okay. It's hard.
So out of 100 cases, you might get a handful that result in the person being freed.
I would say so. Okay. I would agree. Maybe 4 or 5.
which in a sense makes it that much more difficult to do the work that you do, because you really are playing always a heart-wrenching rejection game. You get emotionally vested in this person's life and well-being, knowing that the game is going to end up being the case that 95% of the times you're going to lose. So it's pretty rough, right?
Well, that's what Dylan says in that song, right. Justice is a game. And it is a game because the one factor that Rubin and I know, or he knew and I learned, is that truth is not the issue. That is not the case. A lot of it has to do with publicity and pressure and a whole slew of other things. But truth only becomes relevant when you have conviction review units, people who have no vested interest in sustaining the conviction.
Well, all I can say is not that I ever wish to be in prison, but if I'm ever wrongly convicted of anything, I would want heroes such as yourself and your entourage defending my case. Thank you for being such a wonderful person, for introducing us to David, and I look forward to chatting with him later, and I'm sure he'll have wonderful things to say about you. It was a real pleasure chatting with you, Ken. Please stay on the line, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Gad. Very, very pleasurable talking to you too.
Likewise. Cheers.